Okay, I'm back. I had to run and get something printed. So the Napoleon III style, also known as the Second Empire style, was a highly eclectic style of architecture and decorative arts, which used elements of many different historical styles and also made innovative use of modern materials, such as iron frameworks and glass skylights. It flourished during the reign of Napoleon III in France between 1852 and 1871 and had an important influence on architecture and decoration in the rest of Europe and the United States. Major examples of the style include the Opera Garnier in Paris and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France and the Church of St. Augustine. Okay, so anyway, that is what this Mrs. Mingot's house looks like. She was sure that President. Oh, I said that already. Next page. This is now page 24. Meanwhile, as everyone she cared to see came to her, and she filled her rooms as easily as the Beauforts, it's Beauforts, and without adding a single item to the menu of her suppers, she did not suffer from geographic isolation. People wanted to be her friend. They wanted to go out to the boonies, and but what was interesting is that her food wasn't that good. But this description of her being fat is so comedic. The immense secretion of flesh, which had descended on her in middle life like a flood of lava on a doomed city, had changed her from a plump, active little woman with a neatly turned foot and ankle into something as vast and august as a natural phenomenon. She had accepted this submergence as philosophically as all her other trials, and now, in extreme old age, was rewarded by presenting to her mirror an almost unwrinkled expanse of firm pink and white flesh. And she goes on. Wharton must have laughed to herself as she was writing about this immense woman. In the next paragraph, take a look at some of the detail. It's the detail of the room. Now, Mrs. Mingot is too fat to go upstairs. So she now has people come call on her. It's not really a caller, but um, so she, in characteristic independence, she had made her reception rooms upstairs and established herself in flagrant violation of all the New York proprieties on the ground floor of her house, so that as you sit in her sitting room window with her, you caught through a door that was always open and a loop back yellow damask portiere. That's how a curtain hangs down over a door and you pull it back and loop it and then it stays there. The interesting thing is, and this is where it's not proper, you can see her bedroom through there, which I think it's just hilarious. Her visitors were startled and fascinated by the foreignness of this arrangement. It's French, of course, as if it came out of a French fiction. That was how women with lovers lived in the wicked old societies, in apartments with all the rooms on one floor and all the indecent propinquities that their novels held. In the French novels, of course. Um, at the top of page 25, to the general relief, the Countess Olenska was not present in her grandmother's drawing room during the visit of the betrothed couple. But at any rate, I'm going down a few lines. At any rate, it spared them the embarrassment of her presence and the faint shadow that her unhappy past might seem to shed on their radiant future. Look at the language. There's poor Ellen Olenska is an indelicate thing for a compromised woman to do, versus the radiance of this new couple. There's an interesting passage towards the bottom of page 25. So they're talking about May's engagement ring, and Mrs. Mingot says that it's very handsome. She added, returning the jewel. Very liberal. In my time, it's a big sapphire. I suppose it's like Princess Diana's. In my time, a cameo set in pearls was thought sufficient, but it's the hand that sets off the ring, isn't it, my dear Mr. Archer? And she waved one of her tiny hands with small pointed nails and rolls of fat encircling the wrists like ivory bracelets. The imagery is so fabulous. But this reference to hands is odd. As the this is let's see, as the young bride to be May Welland presents her left hand, recently sapphire ring bejeweled by her fiance Newland Archer, to her socialite grandmother, the grandmother seems more interested in her appendages than in the jewels. But it's the hand, she says. You should have May's done, my child. Her hand is large. It's the modern sports that spread the joints, but the skin is white. And when's the wedding to be? Fixing her eyes on the soon-to-be groom's friends. The vignette here is curious because it reveals much about the Victorians' conviction that hands contain meaning. They represent idealizations and expectations of gender worthy of immortalization in sculpture. When I was reading this, I wasn't able to print this to show it to you, but there were hand molds. People would make molds of their hands, and then just the hand would sit up on a mantelpiece. And there was a hand mold as an example from Princess Beatrice from France, I think, and her husband, and they had these molds, and that's what she's talking about. They should be done. Um, they serve as an index of social anxieties, drawing attention to unruly bodies and desires. They emblemize socioeconomic status, showcasing the trappings of wealth and the hardship of poverty. In fact, the fashion of the age, both popular and scientific, contended that these practices we now call playfully, even derisively, palm reading, could reveal an individual's character and life trajectory. Popular magazines at the time, The Strand included, also tried their hands at arguing for the appendage's intricate significance with a two-part expose that argues the hand, like the face, is indicative or representative of character. The author follows up his self-assured assertion with what amounts delightfully to pin-up shots of famous hands, accompanied by the author's frequent laudatory evaluations of their respective merits. Wilson's enthusiasm uncovers a cultural predilection for objectifying hands that had enjoyed popularity for several decades by the time of his article. And while it remains fashionable even today to suggest otherwise, it proves quite difficult to deny that the Victorians were, in fact, not at all adverse to getting handsy. Isn't that fascinating? I was kind of surprised by this when I was reading it the first time this summer, um, because twice in the same sentence there's a reference to hands. And these casts of hands. You should have May's hands done, and that is what she's talking about, is having them molded, and then you would just put this little delicate hand up on the mantle. Okay, so on the following page, 26, um, there's a couple of amusing references to the fact that Mrs. Mingot's food isn't that good. There's successive statements were received with the proper expressions of amusement, incredulity, and gratitude, and the visit was breaking up in a vein of mild pleasantry. As always, everything is set by this protocol. Next paragraph, there was a cousinly murmur of pleasure between the ladies, and Mrs. Mingot held out Gianni's model to the banker. That Mrs. Mingot had her hands done by this famous Ferrigiani. Let's see, if we go to the top of page 27. Oh, no, down at the bottom, here's the reference to the Beaufort's to the Beauforts to invite for the first time Mrs. Lemuel Struthers, widow of Struthers. Oh, I got these people mixed up. So it's Struthers that were the shoe polish people. And Beaufort is the one who left Europe in apparent some sort of banking fraud, who had returned the previous year from a long initiatory sojourn to Europe to lay siege to the tight little citadel of the New York. So that's a reference to the nouveau riche barging in on the weird this little enclave of people. At the top of page 27, interesting use of language. Well, we need new blood and new money. And I hear she's still very good looking, the carnivorous old lady declared. Notice the language. We need new blood, new meat. Um, and she's carnivorous. So she's open to it as long as they bring in their money. Um, Down at the bottom of page 27, mid at the middle of the last paragraph, it's a mistake for Ellen to be seen the very day after her arrival, parading up Fifth Avenue at the crowded hour with Julius Beaufort, and the young man himself mentally added, and she ought to know that a man who's just engaged doesn't spend his time calling on married women. That's really ironic because that's what he does, or that's what he did in the past. But you see, there's two different sets of standards: insiders versus outsiders, and also men versus women. And in spite of the cosmopolitan views on which he prided himself, he thanked heaven that he was a New Yorker and about to ally himself with one of his own kind. Next paragraph. The next morning, second paragraph. Her old friend, Mrs. Sillerton Jackson, applied to the investigation of his friend's affairs the patience of a collector and the science of a naturalist. Um, he's just an old gossip. He collects these things. Down at the bottom of page 28, sorry. But then New York, as far back as the mind of man could travel, had been divided into the two great fundamental groups of the Mingots and Mansons, and all their clan, who cared about eating and clothes and money, and the Archer Newland Vanderlyden tribe, who were devoted to travel, horticulture, and the best fiction, and looked down on the grosser forms of pleasure. I have a reference here. See Blue Book, page 109. So, yeah, Wharton organizes her narrative around two New York clans linked in a dynastic union. May Welland marries Newland Archer, repeated in minor image in each main branch. The name of Ellen, the exoticized cousin who will threaten this self alliance, is visible at the very center of the page. So, this is a picture of the notes that Wharton drew of the idea she had, and or around this, around the plots, or the plots actually are developed around Ellen Olenska, and she's the one who's going to cause them all kinds of difficulties. Um, Here, defining society, family is the main reference point for Newland and its individual members. The New York, as far back as the mind could remember, towards the compulsion of family to reproduce itself, the burdens of inheritance, the haunting horror of doing the same thing every day at the same hour. That besieged Newland's brain, driving him to his very limited form of rebellion. Later on, he cries, sameness, sameness. In its romantic plot, the narrative marks the damage to individuals within this system. The family's efforts throughout the narrative are to tidy Ellen out of her wayward paths in an almost unmapped quarters back into a settled position at whatever personal costs. So we'll see whether or not Ellen is cornered later on. Next, let's see, I'm on page 29. And just so you know, I think that I have gotten now to about an hour. And this lecture is going to be in two parts because I inadvertently shut off the other one. And so I'm going to put it in two parts. This is part two. It will come all in the same email. Um, Next paragraph, Mrs. Archer, who had long been a widow, lived with her son and daughter in West 28th Street. An upper floor was dedicated to Newland, and the two women squeezed themselves into narrower quarters below. Again, the inequality. In an unclouded harmony of tastes and interests, they cultivated ferns in Wardian cases, made macrame lace and wool embroidery on linen, collected American Revolutionary glazeware, subscribed to Good Words, and read Ouida's novels for the sake of the Italian atmosphere. I looked up all of those things. A Wardian case is the precursor of a terrarium. It had um, um, I forget what it's called. It connected flat sides, and people, and then it would sometimes it wheeled about, and it was about this big, about that tall, and people uh, cultivated plants. So, in other words, and Ouida's novels are for the sake of the Italian atmosphere. Just he's an Italian novelist, a romance novelist, and notice, actually, it was a woman. She is a woman, though, and they're known because of their melodrama. But they're all doing the same thing. Towards the bottom of page 29. Mr. Archer who had been born in Newland, and mother and daughter, who were as like as sisters, were both, as people said, true Newlands, tall, pale, and slightly round-shouldered, with long noses, sweet smiles, and a kind of drooping distinction that in certain faded Reynolds portraits, their physical resemblance would have been complete if an elderly embonpoint had not stretched Mrs. Arthur's black brocade. Well, I guess apparently the only difference between the mother and the daughter, they look so much alike, is that um, Mrs. Archer was drooping a bit in the front. I think that's hilarious. Next page, page 30 at the top of the page. Mentally, the likeness between them, as Newland was aware, was less complete than their identical mannerisms often made it appear. The long habit of living together in mutually dependent intimacy had given them the same vocabulary and the same habit of beginning their phrases, Mother thinks or Janie thinks. Now, this Janie is as much of a milquetoast as May Welland. End of that same paragraph. While Mrs. Archer's serene unimaginativeness rested easily in the accepted and familiar, Janie was subject to starts and aberrations of fancy welling up from the springs of suppressed romance from the novels that they were reading. Let's see. One, two, three, fourth paragraph down. Of course, old Jackson wanted to talk about Ellen Olenska, and of course, Mrs. Archer and Janie wanted to hear what he had to tell. And one propriety didn't say, well, okay, so tell me what you know about her. So they had to dart around this in a conversational way. At the top of page 31, she glanced at Janie and paused. She and Janie knew every fold of the Beaufort mystery, but in public, Mrs. Archer continued to assume the subject was not one for the unmarried. So poor Janie, no one's going to talk in front of her, even if she appears to me to be a spinster. Out of the but this Mrs. Struthers, what did you say she was, Sillerton? Out of a mine, or rather, out of a saloon at the head of a pit. So she's also new rich, and she doesn't have any heritage. Then, with living waxworks, touring England. So in this case, she must have joined up with some sort of display. Something. The first thing that I thought of was Madame Tussauds. If you've been there, you know what that's like. And so it appears as if this Mrs. Struthers went about Europe with a traveling show. Not reputable, I'm sure. Then mid-page. Then Mr. Jackson continued, and Archer saw he was wondering why no one had told the butler never to slice cucumbers with a steel knife. I had to look that one up. I didn't know that you couldn't slice cucumbers with a steel knife, but apparently cucumbers have are acidic and reacts with the knife. So there's a fun fact to know and tell. I did not know that. If you have steel knives, throw them out now if you're going to cut cucumbers. Um, they say his advertiser used the girl's head for the shoe polish posters. Her hair is intensely black, the Egyptian style, suggesting that she too is foreign. Anyhow, he eventually married her. Notice the pause. He eventually married her. There were volumes of innuendo in the way the eventually was spaced, and each syllable given its due stress. You can imagine that they're winking at each other almost. So now they've talked about someone from Europe, someone who has perhaps an untoward background. Finally, they can mention Ellen Olenska. And Newland's new cousin, Countess Olenska, was she at the ball too? Circumventing this, but really what they want to know is everything. Top of page 32. Um, there is a reference, this is the reference I was talking about, to the silly business that Newland Archer participated in with Mrs. Rushworth, as she had remarked to Janie, alluding to what had once seemed to Newland a tragedy of which his soul would always bear the scar. Well, we know that he's kind of given to this sort of romantic flirtation. Next paragraph. Um, all this Mrs. Archer felt, and her son knew she felt, but he knew also that she had been perturbed by the premature announcement of his engagement, or rather by its cause. Again, that's poor Ellen. Ellen is rejected, and towards the bottom of page 32, these indications of inward disturbance moved Archer the more that he felt that the Mingots had gone a little too far. Fourth time that we've heard this. But as it was against all the rules of their code that the mother and son should never allude to what was uppermost in their thoughts, everything is hidden. Um, at the top of page, yeah. Her revenge, he felt, her lawful revenge would be to draw Mr. Jackson that evening on the Countess Olenska. All they want is the gossip. Towards the bottom of page 33, Mrs. Beaufort may not, but Beaufort certainly does, for she was seen walking up Fifth Avenue this afternoon with him by the whole of New York. Second reference to this. So that means that by the time the afternoon arrived, everybody knew that they'd been seen walking up the street. Mercy, moaned Mrs. Archer, evidently perceiving the uselessness of trying to ascribe the actions of foreigners to a sense of delicacy. And in fact, as I mentioned, I think it's in chapter 8, um, the Europeans don't seem to have the rigidity that the American clan does. At the top of page, no, down on page 34, towards the bottom. Why shouldn't she be conspicuous if she chooses? We see in these several pages, Archer defends Ellen Olenska. The first one is in the second paragraph on page 34. He defends her again, following the phrase, why not? Growing suddenly argumentative. Why should she slink about as if it were she who had disgraced herself? She's poor Ellen, certainly, but she had the bad luck to make a wretched marriage. Who's making wretched marriages? But I don't see that there's a reason for hiding her head as if she were the culprit. And down below, Madame Olenska has had an unhappy life that doesn't make her an outcast. So he suddenly finds himself defending her. And then at the very bottom, they say, don't they, he went on, that the secretary helped her to get away from her brute of a husband who kept her practically a prisoner. And again, I hear she means to get a divorce, Janie said boldly. I hope she will, says Archer. And then there's a funny little bit here where Mrs. Archer raised her delicate eyebrows in that particular curve that signified not in front of the butler, not in front of the help. towards the bottom of page 35. Newland reddened. Living together? Well, why not? Who had the right to make her life over if she hadn't? I'm sick of the hypocrisy that would bury alive a woman of her age if her husband prefers to live with harlots. Um, so he's recognizing the double standard. So her husband is having affairs, like Archer did, like several of the other characters are here, and yet they're tolerated because they're men. And yet Ellen is tossed out because she has left a husband who was not a good match. Women, he says, ought to be free as we are. It's an interesting development in Archer. Of course, we have seen all those women characters in the Women Who Did class, and this is the dawning of this in Archer. Next chapter, in the middle of the page, with a new sense of awe, he looked at the frank forehead, serious eyes, and gay, innocent mouth of the young creature whose soul's custodian he was to be. He's going to possess her. I thought that was an interesting um, way of phrasing that because she will be his possession, which is in contrast to the harlots that we just saw, and really suggesting to the innuendo from Ellen Olenska's jaunt that let's see that terrifying product of the social system he belonged to and believed in. The young girl who knew nothing and expected everything looked back at him like a stranger through May Welland's familiar features, and once more it was borne in on him that marriage was not the safe anchorage he had been taught to think, but a voyage on uncharted seas. If you're going to star anything, this is an important element, that statement right there, because people often, we know this, people often chose marriage, especially at the time, as an escape. Wharton chose Teddy as an escape and then discovered that an undesirable match stays undesirable. The case of the Ellen Olenska had stirred up old settled convictions and set them drifting dangerously through his mind. Women should be free as we are. And then he moves on. Nice women, however wronged, would never claim the kind of freedom he meant, and generous minded men like himself were therefore, in the heat of the argument, the more chivalrously ready to concede it to them. These are Newland's thoughts, and if you notice, even the appearance of the pages, there's long paragraphs in which we follow his train of thought. Mid-paragraph on 38, what could he and she really know of each other, since it was his duty as a decent fellow to conceal his past from her, and hers as a marriageable girl to have no past to conceal. Interesting. So, he perceived that such a picture, this a few lines later, presupposed on her part the experience, the versatility, the freedom of judgment which she had been carefully trained not to possess. Trained not to possess. So she and Janie are similar in that way. There's a dull association of material and social interests held together by ignorance on the one side and hypocrisy on the other. Again, a place to be starred. He's seeing this. Lawrence Lefferts occurred to him as the husband who had most completely realized this enviable ideal. As became the high priest of form, he had formed a wife so completely to his own convenience that in the most conspicuous moments of his frequent love affairs with other men's wives, and he's the one that's in charge of form or knows everything about it, she went about in smiling unconsciousness. Poor women. Top of page 39. In reality, they all lived in a kind of hieroglyphic world where the real thing was never said or done or even thought, but only represented by a set of arbitrary signs. Just like what we were introduced to, the hieroglyphics, the signs of prestige and who fits into where in the social order when we were in the um, in the opera box. Men, this is the end of the first incomplete paragraph on 39. Men that people of advanced culture were beginning to read. The savage bride is dragged with shrieks from her parents' tent. Another throwback to perhaps the cavemen or the wandering people, and it's been like that forever. Next paragraph. Let's see. The result, of course, was that the young girl, who was the center of this elaborate system of mystification, remained the more inscrutable for her very frankness and assurance. She was frank, poor darling, because she had nothing to conceal, assured because she knew of nothing to be on her guard against, and with no better preparation than this, she was to be plunged overnight into what people evasively called the facts of life. That is a tidbit from Wharton's own autobiography. At the bottom of this page, all this frankness and innocence were only an artificial product, and he felt himself oppressed by this creation of factious purity, so cunningly manufactured by a conspiracy of mothers and aunts and grandmothers and long dead ancestors, because it was supposed to be what he wanted, what he had a right to, in order that he might exercise his lordly pleasure in smashing it like an image made of snow. So there's some insight here. You can hear Wharton condemning it. Next paragraph on page 40. This is towards the end of the first complete paragraph. Nor could he, for all his anxious cogitations, see honest reason, any that is unconnected with his own momentary pleasure and the passion of masculine vanity. We saw him. He was taking a look at May, and he was proud of having made such a good match. Mid of the next paragraph, all of this was generated in his brain because of the inopportune arrival of the Countess Olenska. Here he was at the very moment of his betrothal, a moment for pure thoughts and cloudless hopes, pitchforked into a coil of scandal which raised all the special problems he would have preferred to let lie. Last sentence of this paragraph, yet he dimly felt that he had only just begun to measure the risks of the championship which his engagement had forced upon him. So what he felt was that he is now part of the Mingot family, and so he had to defend her. So next several paragraphs are the Lovell Mingots had sent out cards for a formal dinner in which to introduce Ellen Olenska. And at the top of the next page, some of the most fashionable and yet most irreproachable of the dominant young married set. Last sentence of this paragraph, the company indeed was perfectly assorted, since all were members belonged to the little inner group of people who, during the long New York season, disported themselves together daily and nightly with apparently undiminished zest. So all these people were invited, and they turned them down. And it was a meanness that the Mingots had to solve. Such a refusal was it could potentially hurt the Mingots' own positions. Nobody even bothered to say why. And on the next page, Wharton gives us a description of how this society is shaped, like a pyramid. You've got the basic people, and as you go up the pyramid, people get higher and more aristocratic. And then there are the top three families, the Dagonets of Washington Square, Shirley Washington Square, the same as Henry James's Washington Square, the Dagonets, the Lannings, and the Vanderlydens. The Vanderlydens are the highest of the high. They are descended from and still have contact with European aristocrats. And so Mrs. Mingot sees that this is a very serious social breach and says that she is going to go and visit Mrs. Vanderlyden. If we don't, let's say, I wish you would go with me, Newland, his mother said. Louisa is fond of you, and of course it's on account of dear May that I'm taking this step, and all because if we don't all stand together, there is no such thing as society left. Back in the back of their minds, of course, is this notion that society is declining because of the influx now of these carpet barons. Chapter 7, um, there's a description here of where does Mrs. van der Luyden come from. There's a great portrait of her created by Huntington. I looked that up. That it just highlights her heritage at the top of page 45. Um, let's see, she has always indeed struck Newland Archer as having been rather gruesomely preserved in the airless atmosphere of a perfectly irreproachable existence, as bodies caught in glaciers keep up for years a rosy life in death. So he's looking at this portrait of her. She's still looking pretty good, but this image of her being preserved in a glacier is like their their little social group is cold and rigid, um, and just like this preservation, and they're trying to keep it. She and Mr. van der Luyden were exactly alike. They had two merged identities. It foreshadows subsequent marriages in this novel. And if you go to page 46, the two of them had the van der Luydens, and this had the same look of frozen gentleness in his eyes. They had a simplicity of reigning sovereignship. So Mrs. Mingot relays the story. Mr. van der Luyden is summoned as if he's Solomon, uh, trying to solve this problem. If we look down at the bottom of page 46, the last sentence, Archer contemplated with awe the two slender, faded figures seated side by side in a kind of vice-regal rigidity, mouthpieces of some remote ancestral authority. So because they are the highest in that pyramid, they have turned to them to solve the problem. He's the let's see, then they blame Lawrence Lefferts for perpetrating this little refusal of their dinner party. I suppose I'd be hurt if I sent out invitations to a dinner party and nobody came either. He's the authority on form, and yet they think that he's the one that generated this. Yet the Leffertses, or Mr. Leffert, is the one who he's the authority on form, and yet he cheats on his wife. And so he is tolerated and Ellen is not. Interesting irony. Down at the bottom of page 47, they were the arbiters of fashion, the court of last appeal, and they knew it and bowed to their fate. So you can see how regal they are. At the top of 48, it's the principle that I dislike. He says, as long as a member of a well-known family is backed up by that family, it should be considered final. And that's his decree. So, in fact, they say on the next page that the husband and wife look at each other. A lot of people look at each other and communicate without just in their eyes, and they think, well, if Louisa's health allowed her to dine out, perhaps we would go there, but we're not going to. We're going to have a small dinner party because my aristocratic relative is coming on over on a boat in order to race a boat. And so Mrs. Archer, let's see, 2 hours later, and here's how the gossip gets about. Everyone knew that the great sea spring baroque, in which Mrs. van der Luyden took the air at all seasons, had been seen at old Mrs. Mingot's door, where a large square envelope was handed in. So the sea spring is a 4-horse carriage, and it's very luxurious. And leather, it's not small and contained like this one. It's open. Remember the carriage that William and Kate rode in, the open air one? That's what this looks like. So everyone knew, because everything gets around in this little society, everyone knew that that the van der Luydens carriage had been seen at their door. Not the Mrs. Mrs. Vanderleiden didn't go in because she's not well, and we just think that they're shy. And in fact, I think Wharton says that she's shy, and neither one of them go out much. But they invited Countess Olenska to this event, thus sanctioning her. She sanctioned. That's it. So with that, I'm going to come to an end. Um, I think I said on the syllabus that we were going to go to page 50. So we will end here. I believe been going on for an hour and 30 minutes. I'm no longer sure. So we'll stop here. If you have questions, feel free to ask them, and I will try to address them at the beginning of the next lecture. So have a nice day, and remember that I'm pretty sure that I have to upload two two parts of this lecture. So have a nice week and be safe, and I will talk to you next week. Goodbye.